So here it is. Here's the biblical priorities list. It goes like this: God, spouse, children, job, church, friends, and the list goes on. And I'll show you in a minute where you find that in Scripture. But let me just, in case you're confused about this, there's an alternative. There's the unbiblical priority list, and it's golf, motorcycle, video games, your drinking buddies, your girlfriend, your job, maybe your family if you have time. How many of you know that guy, by the way? How many of you know that guy? How many of you are that guy? Seriously, no hands? I could point a few of you out right now, but I'm going to save you the shame.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
So today, I'm beginning a brand new series called Courageous Parenting. Now here's the thing, if parenting was easy, you wouldn't need to be a courageous parent, but parenting is not easy, therefore you need to be. So when I look at parenting, I like to sometimes zoom out the lens and sort of remind myself what it's all about. And I think, starting at the beginning, I think pregnancy is God's way of reminding us the task ahead, right? I mean, it's 9 months of morning sickness, bloating, hemorrhoids. There's blood, sweat, tears, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. And apparently, it's uncomfortable for the wife as well. Then, of course, the baby comes out, and the baby starts crying, and the baby cries, and when it's done crying, it cries some more. And, cries when it's hungry, and it cries when it's tired, and it cries when it's poopy, and it's cried at 37 when you kick it out of the house. And then, of course, the toddler comes along. Well, there's nothing more fun than going out with a 2-year-old, right? It's like walking around with your drunk little friend, right? I mean, slurs when it speaks, staggers when it walks, stumbles into objects, falls down, cries, you pick him up, he vomits on you and pees his pants. Just like university days, remember? And then, of course, you think, okay, they've finally gone off to school, I'm going to get a little breather, life's going to be a little bit easier. No, it's not. You are going to spend 4 hours every single day driving them to and from school and to sports and to events and to practices and to dance lessons. And then God help you if you put your kids into hockey, you might as well remortgage your house right now, because hockey costs approximately all the money you have in general. And then they become teenagers and they go up into their room and they lock themselves in there for 6 hours every single night doing God knows what. Now that's the good stuff. There's some negatives too about parenting. Like the fact that there has never been a more challenging time to parent kids than the day we are living in right now. I mean, think about it. The world has gone stark raving mad. We have forgotten what marriage is. We're confused about sex. We're confused about gender. We don't know right from wrong. And then there is social media, the toxic wasteland. This is why you need to be a courageous parent. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a story of some courageous parents in Scripture. It's actually an Old Testament story that's referenced in the New Testament. We're going to look at it in Hebrews chapter 11. But you know the story. It's the story of Moses' parents. So let me kind of remind you of the story. It goes like this. So the Jews have been in Egypt, living in the land of Goshen for 430 years. And what's happening is they're growing, they're expanding, they're getting stronger and more powerful. And the Pharaoh starts to worry that maybe they're going to rise up and rebel against Egypt. So he comes up with a plan. And his plan is this, just to bump off all the newborn males. So he thinks if there's no males, then there won't be any trouble. Apparently he doesn't understand that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. But that's a Mother's Day message. So we look at this story and we see what happens. He has this idea. He goes to the midwives of the Jewish women, and he says, here's what you're going to do. If a newborn girl is born, if you deliver a girl, you let her live. If you deliver a boy, if you wouldn't mind, it wouldn't be too much trouble if you could just kill the boy. And so the midwives are okay. And of course, they're not going to kill any of these children. They're not going to do it. It's not their job. So Pharaoh can't figure it out why there's all these male children running around. So he calls in the midwives and he says, why aren't you killing the male children that are born? And the midwives say, I love it. You got to go read it. It's a hilarious story. They say, well, you see, Jewish women aren't like Egyptian women. Egyptian women, they have such a hard time giving birth, but the Jewish women, they just sort of squirt those babies out left and right, and the baby's born before we even get there, so we don't have a chance to kill it. But anyway, the story goes like this. These babies were just kind of popping out before the midwives apparently had a chance to bump them off. So the Pharaoh comes up with a second idea. He says, well, this is what we'll do. We'll just send the soldiers around to every household, and they'll find the newborn males, throw them in the Nile River, and they'll drown. Problem solved. So that's where we pick up the story. And I want you to listen to this. It's in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. It says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction when the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. So, of course, this little child, Moses, is born, and there's this decree to go throw them all in the river. And it says, by faith, his parents actually saved this child by hiding him for 3 months. And this is what it says. Because the child was beautiful, they did not fear the king. Which tells me that if the baby was ugly, they would have taken it differently. I wasn't the guy who wrote this stuff. No, what does it tell you? It means that all children are beautiful, because children are created in the image of God. They are fearfully and wonderfully made, and when this baby came into the world, you can't but love this child. Every child is a gift of God, and every child is beautiful. And after 3 months, the parents can't hide the child anymore. So they have to come up with another plan. Now, the plan sounds a bit crazy, but this is what they did. They put the baby in a basket with pitch around it so it wouldn't sink, and they set it on the river, and they floated it down the river. And they sent his sister, older sister Miriam, to go watch and see where it landed. They weren't killing the child. They weren't sending it off. They were doing, in desperation, an act of faith. The child floated down the river and floated right up on the steps where the Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. She pulled the baby out of the water, and here's the thing. When you see a child, when you look it in its face, you can't help but think it's a beautiful child. She thought that too. And she decided she was going to keep it as her own. So Miriam goes up to her and says, would you like me to go get a nursing mother for the child? She said, that would be great. They hired Moses' mother and paid her to nurse her own child, Moses. You gotta love this story, don't you? Now, eventually what happened is, of course, Moses ended up being raised in Pharaoh's house. And when he came of age, he realized something, that this is not who he was. And he knew that he was of the Jewish people. And it said he, by faith, forsook Egypt, by faith, not fearing the wrath of the king. You see are you following this? Courageous parents produce courageous children. And see, here's what you need to be reminded of. Courageous parents are not afraid of what the world could do to your children. You know why? Because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world, right? Courageous parents are not afraid of losing their children and them wandering away and rebelling against the faith, because they know you shall train up a child in the way they shall go, and when they're old, they will not depart. Courageous parents are not afraid of their children. I'm not joking about this. I am so astounded. The fact that I see so many parents that are actually kind of, in a way, afraid of their kids. What do I mean by that? They're afraid to discipline them because they're afraid of how they'll react. They're afraid to withhold anything or deny them anything because of how it might cause them to respond. And sometimes they're just afraid that their kids aren't going to like them. Are you kidding me? I'm going to give you 3 simple things that all of you can integrate into your parenting, and they're not complicated, and here's what they are. Number 1, unconfused priorities. Number 2, uncommon affirmation. And number 3, unconditional love. So the first thing is this. It is unconfused priorities. So I've been in the ministry some 40-some years now. And I remember when I was a new pastor trying to figure it out, and I would go to pastors' conferences, and I paid good money, and I went to this pastor's conference because I didn't know what I was doing. I still don't know, but I don't tell anybody anymore. But back then, I needed to go to a conference, so I went to this conference, and this guy was going to help us, and I figured I was going to get some tips and strategies as to how to pastor. And he says, I want to talk to you guys about the smartest thing you can ever do as a pastor, and here's what it is. He says, you need to love your wife. I'm thinking, really? That's your tip? I need to love my wife? I was going to love my wife anyway, well, at least for a while. I mean, that was my plan all along. What do you mean I need to love my wife? And then he went on to explain that, that by loving your wife, it's a great example for your congregation, and it's a great example for your children. And he spent the whole time on this, and I went away so disappointed that the only thing I got out of that session was this, that pastors should love their wives. Think about this. Here I am 40-some years later, and I remember it as clear as day. So obviously it sunk in. Obviously it was important. But I'm telling you something. It actually took me quite a few years before I really realized the gravity of what he had said. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about. When it comes to our priorities in life, and when you get married and when you have kids, priorities kind of shift a little bit. And in a lot of cases, not all of them, but if you look at the husband in a family situation, what is oftentimes his number one priority? And be honest, what is it? Yeah, it's his job, it's his work, it's his career. And then, of course, when the kids come along, the wife, what's her number one priority? More often than not, the kids. And so you have him pursuing his job, and you have the wife pursuing the kids, and here's what happens. That goes on for 20 years, and then the kids go off to college or wherever they go, they're 20 years old, and then this husband and wife are living in a house, and they look at each other one day and they go, who are you? Right? Because they didn't cultivate their own relationship and make their spouse their priority, they forgot to love one another. I saw this play out in my own parents' life. My mother raised the kids for the most part. My dad was always at work. I mean, he worked so hard, and I have a lot of respect for him in a lot of ways, but he wasn't there a lot of times when he probably needed to be there. I'll give you one little example. When it was Sunday morning, my mother would pack us all up, all 6 of us kids, into the station wagon, and off we'd go to church. My dad slept in. Nobody begrudged that. He worked hard all week, so he slept in on Sunday morning. But when we got home from church around noon, my dad was gone, and he didn't go golfing. He went to the office every Sunday afternoon to catch up on his work. And then he'd be home for dinner on Sunday night, and then I'd ask him, I'd say, Dad, how come you have to work on Sunday? Nobody else's dad works on Sunday. And he used to say this. He used to say, I've got to keep the wolf away from the door. That's a reference to the 3 little pigs, you know that? And of course, I'm a pretty smart little kid, and I'm thinking, if you're keeping the wolf away from the door, wouldn't you do a better job of that if you were somewhere near the door to keep him away? I mean, I never understood what he was talking about. So nevertheless, when I was 20 years old, guess what? My parents separated. That's why I'm so messed up. I come from a broken family. You know that, right? No, so seriously, this happens all the time. And so we get our priorities all messed up. So here it is. Here's the biblical priorities list. It goes like this. God, spouse, children, job, church, friends, and the list goes on and on. And I'll show you in a minute where you find that in Scripture. But let me, just in case you're confused about this, there's an alternative. There's the unbiblical priority list, and it's golf, motorcycle, video games, your drinking buddies, your girlfriend, your job, maybe your family if you have time. How many of you know that guy, by the way? How many of you know that guy? How many of you are that guy? Seriously, no hands? I could point a few of you out right now, but I'm going to save you the shame. So we have this list. And we have these priorities, and these priorities are correct. There's nothing wrong with these priorities. They are biblically correct, and here's where it comes from. So all you have to do is different ways you can figure it out, but the easiest way is you just go read the book of Genesis, and the order of appearance is the order of importance. And so Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. So God is the most important. Genesis chapter 2, God creates a spouse for Adam. Genesis chapter 4, they have children, Cain and Abel. Also Genesis chapter 4, these children have jobs. One's a shepherd and one's a grain grower. Genesis 22, there's the place of worship. And so you see all of these things folding out over a period of time, and you can easily make this list of priorities. So I hear this all the time from people. People come up to me and say, Pastor Mark, I know we haven't been in church for a few months, but Dylan's in hockey, and that's on Sunday morning. And it's like you always say, family's our priority. So, is that really what I say? Anyway, that's what he has said. But so that might be what he's thinking. Family is a priority. What do you think Dylan hears? What do you think Dylan thinks his priority is? It's hockey. That's the message he gets. I'm not insulting hockey here. I'm just saying that this is how we get messed up in this. And so I don't think that a list is a healthy way to live. And so I look at it different. I have what I use, and it may or may not work for you. I use what I call a biblical priority wheel. Here's the picture of this. And what I think we need to do is we need to put God in the center of our life. We need to have Christocentric lives where Christ is the center and we live out of our relationship with God in everything we do. You know this work-life balance they talk about all the time? They're always talking about work-life balance. There's no such thing. That's a myth. How do you get your life perfectly balanced? I got everything perfectly in balance. Well, as soon as something happens, as soon as there's a crisis, everything's out of balance again, right? I mean, if somebody dies, guess what? That's your priority. If there's a crisis at work, guess what? That's your priority. If you go on vacation, I'm pretty sure you're not trying to balance work in that, or you shouldn't be. You should be wholly focusing on your family. And so what I've discovered is that people have time for their passions. People have time for their passions. Am I right about that? People say to me, oh, Pastor Mark, I get involved with the church, but I just don't have time. And I go, I'm not going to be mean here, but you're not being honest with yourself. It's not that you don't have time, you don't have passion. Because people who have passion will find time for it. If you are passionate about golf, let me pick on them for a while. If you're passionate about golf, which is more time consuming than being the president of the United States, if you're passionate about golf, you will find time to do it. That's why you have to live out your life towards your passions. So when I was 10 years old, my parents took me over to some friends of theirs, and the husband was building a boat in his living room. And they didn't have any furniture in the living room, but he had a table saw and he had a bandsaw and there was sawdust everywhere. And I looked at that and I went, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I'm 10, right? This is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Now on the drive home, I got this feeling my parents were not quite as enamored with it as I was. But I made a decision that day at 10 years old. I thought, when I'm older and I have a house on my own, I'm going to build a boat in the living room. That's what I'm going to do. So here's what happened. I got married, I bought a house. Turned out Kathy had other ideas for what she wanted to do with our living room. She wanted furniture in it. What's that all about? Anyway, so, we compromised and we got furniture. But I never lost my passion to build the boat. I still wanted to build this boat. I wanted to do this my whole life. And so in 2010, I actually found this boat and I decided I was going to build a boat. And so I'm going to show you a picture of it. Here it is. It was the ugliest thing you've ever seen. All it was a hull. I had to tear the floor out. It was all rotten. It was all waterlogged, and it was full of cockroaches. And so all it was this bare boat. I dragged it all the way up from Nashville, Tennessee. It had no floor once I tore it out. It had no gauges, no steering wheel, it had no nothing. It was this bare hull. And I thought, I am going to take this hull, and I'm going to build a speedboat out of it. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, Pastor Mark, where would you, of all people, find time to build a boat? But it dawned on me I had more time than I thought I did, because I was doing absolutely nothing between midnight and 8 a.m. every night. I'm not a great sleeper. I only sleep a few hours a night anyway. I thought, I am wasting this 8 hours. So, honest to God truth, I built this boat in the middle of the night. And so what would happen is Kathy would go to bed at about 11 o'clock, and I would sneak out of the house. And I would go build the boat into the wee hours of the night. And she'd wake up in the middle of the night, and the bed was empty, and she would phone me and say, where are you? She thought I had a mistress, which I sort of did, if you think about it. My mistress, the sea, right? So anyway, I built this boat, and I had this goal that I was going to finish the boat by July 1st, Canada Day, and it was going to be in the water by July 1st. And so I was really under the crunch. So on June 30th, I pulled an all-nighter from 11 p.m. to 8 a.m., and by 9 a.m. in the morning on July 1st, the boat was sitting in the driveway on the trailer, ready to go. By that afternoon, it was floating on Lake of the Woods. Check that puppy out. Yeah, you got that right. Oh, yeah. My own two hands, my pride and joy. That boat did 74 miles an hour. It was an absolute rocket ship. You know what I did with that boat? I sold it because it turned out to be a bit of a point of contention in our marriage. But I didn't care. I did it. And so here's the whole point I'm trying to make, is that we have time for our passions. Don't fool yourself. And so what you need to do, you need to have unconfused priorities. And you need to be passionate for your spouse and your children and your family and your church and your workplace and your sports. And you have time for whatever you have passion for. All right? So that's the first point. Second point is this, is that we need to have uncommon affirmation for our children. So let me give you my observation of growing up as a young person and observing emerging generations. And it seems that every emerging generation I have witnessed, a large percentage of these young people struggle with their self-esteem. We see low self-worth and low self-confidence and low self-esteem. And it doesn't matter. I saw it when I grew up. And I mean, unless you were the captain of the football team, they seem to have it all together somehow. But the rest of us were wallowing in our self-pity and our self-loathing and this low self-esteem. And it's fascinating to me because if you look into Scripture, you see a story about it. I call it the Gideon effect. And I'll remind you of the story. Most of you know it. But it's in Judges chapter 6. And you have Gideon. He's this young man. And he's down in the bottom of the wine press and he's threshing wheat. Is that where you threshed wheat? No, you did it at the top of the hill. You threw the wheat in the air. The wind blew away the chaff. And that's how you separated the wheat from the chaff. He's down in the bottom of the wine press. And why was he there? For fear, because the land had been overrun by the Midianites. And so he was fearful. So we know here was a guy wallowing in his fear and his low self-esteem and everything else. And God appears to him and says, "Oh, Gideon, I got a plan for your life, and I want you to go and defeat the Midianites as one man." And he immediately comes back and he says this, "But don't you know, Lord, that I am the least in my father's house, and my clan is the weakest in all Manasseh." Did you hear that? He was the least and the weakest, and he was a loser and came from a long line of losers, and he suffered from an inferiority complex and low self-esteem and low self-image and all of the things that young people seem to be struggling with today. But God speaks to him and says, "Arise in this might of yours, and rise up, you mighty man of valor." Now here's my question. Did God see him differently than he saw himself? His Father in heaven reminded him who he was. And who you are is not based on what you do. Who you are is based on who you are. Now this is an important distinction in this. Because here's one of the challenges we have. We a lot of times get into this performance orientation where we affirm our children based on what they do instead of who they are. And the example of that is actually Jesus himself. He's 30 years old. He's getting baptized in the Jordan River. He comes up out of the Jordan River, and the voice from heaven comes and says, "Behold, you are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Now, here's my question for you. What had Jesus done up to that point? Nothing. He hadn't preached a sermon, hadn't raised the dead, hadn't healed the sick, hadn't cleansed the leper, had not done one single thing, because he wasn't beloved, and he wasn't pleased with him because of what he did, but who he was. The fact that he was the beloved Son. And see, that's how we need to honor and affirm our children, with this uncommon affirmation that we remind them who they are based on who they are, not based on what they've done. Now we struggle with this, don't we? We struggle with this. And we're really good with it when our kids are little. I mean, it's actually kind of funny, isn't it? When your kids are very little, everything thrills you. You're enthused about, they pass gas and you're so pleased. They burp and you go, "Oh, good boy." Boy, nothing's more entertaining than watching potty training. I'm telling you, that's a good boy. That's a good boy. You're such a good boy. I'm thinking, he pooped in a pot. Are you that excited about him pooping in a pot? And it's a funny thing, we're so encouraging when they're learning how to walk. And we're going, come on. We're just so excited about every little thing and who they are. But then when they're a teenager, everything they do drives us crazy. Way to get to school on time, Dylan, for your exam. Maybe if you had studied, you would have got something higher than a D, right? It just drives us crazy because we're busy affirming them for what they do instead of who they are. Now, I'm not talking about building up this sense of false confidence or arrogance in little children or child worship. Nothing's worse than that when parents are, bragging about their kids all the time. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this uncommon affirmation that we instill into the sense of these kids as to who they are in Christ, that they are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that they have a purpose and a meaning in life. And this is the thing that is lost from the youth culture today. So the first thing is this: it's got to be unconfused priorities. The second thing, it's got to be uncommon affirmation. The last and final thing, and I'll crash land into this message, is got to be unconditional love. And unconditional love is our secret weapon as the family. Let me tell you why. Because there is nobody in this world that put up with more heartache and more grief and more bad behavior and more stupidity than the family will. Why? Because we understand unconditional love. We understand that love never fails. We understand that love covers a multitude of sins. And the story we have, the emblematic story from Scripture, of course, is the story of the prodigal son. And I know it's an allegory for God's love and forgiveness for us. And the son goes off and spends his inheritance on wine, women, and song, and his whole life is a disaster. And then he comes to his senses and he came to his senses. And he thinks, I'll return back to my father and I'll beg to be a servant because I know I'm not worthy to be a son. But when he ends up on the road home, his father runs to greet him, throws his arms around his neck and kisses him. And instead of saying, do you have any money left? What did you do with the money? What have you been up to? What's wrong with you, Dylan? What's your problem? Instead of saying that, he gave him the robe and the ring and the sandals, and he killed the fatted calf. He never asked him what he had done. He never asked him where he had been. He showed him unconditional love, just like God shows us unconditional love when we come to him after all our bad behavior. But the same thing is true in the family. Let me just share one final story in closing here. So some of you would know the name Bill Hybels. He at one time pastored the largest church in North America, Willow Creek Church in Chicago, Illinois. And I only heard him speak twice live, once in Winnipeg here, and then a second time at a conference down in the U.S. And he was just about to come out on stage while he did, and he said, instead of taking my session and speaking to you, I'm going to do something I've never done before. And I'm going to sit on stage with my wife and my two grown children, Todd, age 32, and my daughter, Shauna, age 35, and we're going to tell you the story of our family. Here's the picture from the actual conference that I was at. And so that's Bill Hybels on the right there, and that's his daughter, Shauna, sitting right beside him. She's 35 years old in this story. And so she starts telling her story about how at 20 years old, she rebelled against the church, against God, against the family, and how she left Chicago and she went to Berkeley, California, and she was looking for the meaning of life. And she experimented with everything 20-year-olds experiment with in California, and so I probably don't need to go into that as to what that was. And she said, what I was really searching for this time in California is I was searching for authentic community. And then she said, and then one day, after I found myself at the very bottom, I came to my senses, and I realized the thing I had been looking for all of these years was what I had left behind, my family and my church and the love that I had from them. And I came back to Chicago and I asked my parents to forgive me. Now, by this point, she's an adult, right? But to forgive me for what I had done. And she says the whole time they had extended unconditional love to me. They never judged me. They never criticized me. My father never was embarrassed to the church, never said to the elders, and complained, and what am I going to say to the elders about your bad behavior? Just continued to extend unconditional love again and again and again to his daughter. And she sat on that stage in front of 5,000 people and apologized to her parents for what she had done. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was one of the most profound and poignant moments I've ever seen. And I thought, that's what it's all about. See, only family can extend this thing called unconditional love. Because love never fails, and love covers a multitude of sins. Let's stand together, shall we?
If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.